Welcome, and thanks for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, we'd encourage you to please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. This really helps other folks find out about the podcast, our great guests, and the wisdom that they have to share. So without further ado, on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Mr. Stephen Pedigo, Director of the NYU Urban Lab at the Schack Institute of Real Estate. How are you doing today, Stephen?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me today.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on, especially as we're kind of in the festive season here, but I imagine you still got a few things to do before we head off for the holidays.
I'm actually finishing up my last little bit of work at the office today. So I'm looking forward to having a nice break. One of the great things about being at NYU is that we get some time off just like our students. So.
Oh, very good. Well, I wonder if you can kind of start us off with some of your story, your background, and then kind of what you view your role as these days.
Sure. So as mentioned, I'm at the Schack Institute of Real Estate. I run a little bit of an applied research engagement center here at the school that brings together city officials, developers, folks who think about real estate to have conversations about how our built environment is changing and sort of what are the trends that are shaping the way that we sort of live, work, and play in cities today. So, we do everything from some applied research to hosting convenings and events. So, for instance, we've done a series. This semester is a great example of some of the events that we did. We hosted an event with Jody McLean, who's the president, CEO and president of Eden's, which is the major development company doing the Union Market development in Washington, D.C. We was really interested in the question about how do we build more inclusive communities and what's the role of the real estate community there. We've hosted an event looking at driverless cities and this idea of the world that the effect that autonomous vehicles will have on our cities, and then just recently we brought together a group of folks here in New York that looking at how science and technology and innovation is sort of changing the real estate market here, particularly with the development of downtown Brooklyn, the Cornell campus, et cetera. So that's my day job in terms of being at NYU and teaching and doing those types of things. And then I also do a lot of advising, consulting work for cities across the world. As you know, I work with Rich Florida at the Creative Class Group, and we work with cities, as I said, small, medium, large cities all over the world, thinking about economic development strategies and how they build sort of more inclusive communities. So that's a little bit about my work.
Well, I'm interested in this kind of intersection there. We've got the economic development work, and then you've got the real estate work, and I kind of wonder how you tie those two together in some ways.
That's a very good question. In fact, it's interesting. Like I am, by training and by trade, I sort of see myself as an economic developer. It's the world that I sort of have lived in from early part of my career to where I am now. But it's interesting being in a real estate school. I think what's interesting about sort of the world of economic development and real estate development is a lot of times the two groups don't talk to each other. In fact, and as much as those worlds are critically important to each other. A lot of times, economic developers don't really understand the world of real estate development, and real estate developers don't understand the world of economic development. And so, I think it is one of the things that's exciting about the things that we're doing here at Schack is trying to take our what are majority real estate students and sort of educate them about how cities work, how economic development works, because it becomes very important in terms of their plan and sort of the way that they see cities. And so, I think we need more of that. It's interesting, right? We have associations where economic developers sort of hang out, and we have associations with real estate developers sort of hang out. And so, it's I think as we look more about coming together, thinking about the idea of clustering in cities, this question about how the two worlds and how the two sort of fields overlap to each other will be really important in trying to get people to understand and really sort of communicate together. So that's a lot of what we're actually trying to accomplish at the lab is to say, look, cities matter to you as real estate developers, and your work matters to city officials, and trying to bring those people together.
Well, it's interesting because I think that there's many times when we see real estate developers can get a bad rap. They can often be seen as like the the boogeyman of the urban sphere in some ways. And I wonder, kind of, so is part of the work then to bring them into the fold of this more community development side, that say that, hey, you guys are an important part of what makes cities work?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's a fair, particularly as you think about, this idea of folks coming back to cities, looking at the urban cores growing. I mean, we and I had just talked earlier, even the development in downtown Roanoke, right, where you are. I mean, the development of that community and that urban core can be looked at sort of in two ways, right? One could say, look, it's great that development's happening. The other could be say, look, the real estate development community has been sort of, maybe not the best thing a lot of times for communities, particularly in places like San Francisco and where I am here in New York and other in Seattle and other cities where you sort of see this contested battle, quote unquote contested battle for space. I think the thing that we're trying to do is to your point, is to say to the real estate communities, look, you play a vital role in community development, and you play a vital role in our communities, and sort of what you do and the way that you sort of the things that you do, both with your development as well as we think about not just site development but also city and community neighborhood development, plays a really important role. And in fact, we just I'll plug a little bit of the work that we just recently did. We did, to that end, we've done some work recently about this idea of we call building inclusive prosperity, and then on that in that framework, we sort of outline several things that the real estate community and these anchor-based institutions really have to do. And if you think about it, we've written about and talked about in the world of economic development for a really long time about the role of anchor institutions, but not really about thinking about real estate developers as anchor-based institutions. And so, when you think about a development like Eden's Union Market in Washington, D.C., significant development in the northeast part of that city, that will transform the sort of the fabric and the fabric and future of that community going forward. So what do real estate developers have to do? They got to think about building more affordable housing. They have to think about how they develop space that really supports entrepreneurship. They have to think about how they're building more inclusive communities in terms of place design, in terms of the way that we think about public space. They have to be very cognizant about the types of tenants that they pick for the developments, et cetera. So there are lots of different ways and lots of different tools that developers can take in terms of playing a more, as you suggested, and I think this is right, a vital role in community development as well.
Do you think that part of that is also showing that when a developer engages with that community, that there's actually a lot of benefit that they can reap personally out of that equation as well?
Absolutely, right. I mean, I think the question look, a lot of developers are developing large scale. We're not, when we talk about development now, Dan, particularly in a lot of the larger American cities, for instance, we're not talking about just sort of a building here. We're talking about a lot of it being neighborhood development. Look at what happened in the Wynwood district in Miami, or you could point to a lot of the developments happening for instance, in downtown Seattle, that happened in downtown Seattle or downtown Newark. A lot of that now is larger scale types of development. And so one of the things that becomes important for them in terms of playing a good role, or that good steward role, is that placemaking. It is that programming of that space. It is sort of the necessary need of needing to bring those places to life. And so developers you can't really, in a sense, depend on the community to do that for you. You have to play one of the things that we're suggesting is to folks is that you have to actually play an active role in programming that space and thinking about being very intentional about the placemaking activities that you're putting together, and being very intentional about the types of businesses and folks that are there. Because again, it's good for you, all right? It creates that environment, but it's also good for the community as well.
Well, I'm intrigued as well that I think, we're seeing the potential that historic tax credits are going to go away. We're seeing that gentrification is becoming a bigger and bigger topic in bigger cities, and that tax credit maybe means more in smaller cities, but in those bigger cities you have these gentrification pressures. I wonder, kind of, as you think about the future of real estate development, what are some of the maybe one or two biggest questions you think that we haven't quite figured out at this point?
Well, I think for one, is this question of for developers is, and I think it's getting to the forefront of how do you do this in a way, how do you make the balance sheet work? How do you make the development work on and pencil out, but also do it from a perspective that it really does build sort of that inclusivity to it and really has that inclusive framework. So this idea of a pathway forward in terms of raising the question of, as we talk about inclusive prosperity, okay, what does that really mean? What does it really mean in terms of needing to build more affordable housing? We hear that over and over in many of our cities, and the pressure is on developers to make that happen. So, but really, what does that mean for the private sector? But also, what does it mean for the public sector? What role does the public sector have to play here to make that work? I think that going forward, I think we'll see. Look, I think. You look at federal policy. You look at federal policy. The federal government is basically out of economic. It's really sort of moving out of economic and urban development, just in terms of any types of investments they're making, both from a policy perspective, but also from a funding perspective. States are increasingly, I think, seeing resources become more constrained and limited. So, that has trickled down to cities. And so the question really says that as you want to think about the transformation of our cities, who will lead that? I think a big player of that in terms of thinking to the future real estate development will be the role of this larger, broader description of not just of anchor-based institutions. Traditionally we have thought of that as just being meds and eds, but one of the things that I think we're starting to see is that it's not just about meds and eds, but it is about real estate development, developers that are doing large-scale development. It's also large, major technology-based companies, corporate entities are having to play a role. So I think, one of the trends that I would suggest is this larger role of the quote unquote private or real estate sector development. And there are places all over the country that have seen success with this, right? Look at the revival of downtown Detroit. One could argue that Dan Gilbert and Quicken Loans has been a huge player in that. And so this rise of the private sector playing more of a public role, I think will be something that we see.
This kind of gets back to that earlier question where, the difference between economic development and real estate development, because I do think that we often think of that economic development as that's something that the government does for the community, and then real estate development is something that, private individuals come in, they want to make money, those things. But, they kind of, we're seeing that line become wishy-washy, I think, when I hear you say some of those things.
No, I think that is very much true in terms of the both, as we had traditionally defined those roles, sort of being very blurred now. I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, I think about a lot of my students here at NYU, which many of them will go work for private development companies and be very successful. But we have a growing number of real estate developers who are having a growing interest in the role of cities, and particularly are now finding themselves not just for working for private developers, but going to work for the city. For instance, here in New York, it's the EDC, which is one of the largest landholders in the city in terms of managing of assets. And so, I do think that we are seeing this interesting blur of both of these fields, but also I think there is still absolutely, in my mind, a need for both sides of that coin to sort of better understand, what is economic development. I cringe when I go from community to community, sometimes across the country, and the folks that are leading the economic development units are former real estate folks who don't really understand, asset-based economic development. They understand they still live in a world of square feet and retail and and commercial space, but don't understand, asset-led economic development, and then, what are the externalities that all this creates, all the challenges that this creates as well. So there is still this need, I think, for both sides to better understand each other. But to your point, I do think we see a little bit of a blurring here.
Well, I'm interested when people talk about real estate, as I mentioned, they've kind of been viewed as the boogeyman somewhat, although we know that they can play a huge role, and we see those many of the examples you mentioned, how they've been incredibly important in moving communities forward. But I wonder kind of when you're in a community that doesn't see the importance of supporting a real estate development, or that doesn't see why they should be looking and thinking about those issues, what do you kind of bring to their mind in terms of to get them to think that these are important issues to be considering?
Well, so I mean, now we know, right? So much of the impact of the built environment has a huge impact now on sort of the trajectory of your community, right? I mean, a great example of this, I recently did a project in Vancouver, Washington, which is on the other side of the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon, as part of the Portland-Vancouver MSA, and one of the things that was very interesting about that city is that, yes, it's a suburban community. Yes, it's a little bit more conservative than Portland. It's very much a little bit more of your sort of traditional suburban business environment. But what was very interesting for me as we were there is that you had a community that was wanting to think about how they could attract entrepreneurs and attract startup companies from Portland and be that alternative. And one of the things that I don't think they realized or understood was one of the main assets that they had, and they thought that, from a real estate perspective, from a development perspective, they thought they needed a technology campus that was connected to their university. But one of the things that they didn't realize is they had one of the most amazing urban assets, one of the most basic urban real estate assets, and that was a very walkable downtown, right? In terms of understanding, and yes, it needs some tweaks, and yes, it needs some programming, but it was an undervalued asset. So one of the things that, I think a lot of times that we have to do as both economic developers as real estate developers, educate folks about what do we know are the growing trends in this space, right? What do we know to be, the driving assets for what certain types of businesses or certain types of target investment groups are looking for. And for this group, it was about the idea of the fact that you had an urban walkable downtown. And there was a bit of an education process about getting them to understand the need, what entrepreneurs are looking for today, that it wasn't about traditional experiences, that it was about this urban environment, and that, yes, you have it, but you also have to invest in it. And so, I think a lot of times it is about just sort of this education process. I think on the economic development side of things, I think one of the things that we as an economic practice or group of folks that don't really still grasp is understand the value of land and land economics, right? And that is to say, not all, as I tell my students, not all development is created equal, right? And so land figures in the way that we use land, from zoning and all in the practices of land, plays a really important role in terms of how it fits within our economic development agenda, right? Is it going to be residential, commercial? Is it going to be industrial land? What's the value of that? And then asking that question about how does it all fit within the needs and skills of your workforce and what the community wants to be going forward. So understanding the importance of land is a critical piece of this for the economic development community, as much as it is about the real estate community needing to understand what drives economies going forward.
Well, you guys are in this unique position being part of the academy there at NYU, where there's incredible research happening all the time, but to be connected with other academic institutions where and you see this research happening, that you can see where best practices are, where things are failing. And I'm wondering kind of how you communicate that when you go into a community that doesn't recognize walkability or bikeability as an important asset. How do you kind of convince them that is crucial for them to think about?
Well, I think it's lots of ways to, in terms of, I think what you're asking about is how do you get folks to really sort of think about best practice sharing, right, and benchmarking. When I'm doing any types of engagements, one of the things I always tell my clients and folks that we're working with is that we want to pick benchmarks that, who we think we're a little bit alike, who has a lot of the same amenities and assets to us, people that we aspire to be with, but also this question about types of communities that we can learn from as well. And so, I think, being very, I think out of the gate is that when you engage with communities or communities are sort of thinking about sort of the self-reflection as being very reflective and being sort of pragmatic about the types of communities that you are like, who you are, and, places that you can learn things around. So this sort of question of benchmark selection is really important. I do think that there is value. So that would be, I think, this data benchmark piece to this, right? That's important. I think, and that in my mind sort of sets a framework for that. I think, in terms of best practice sharing, I think one of the best things that you can do is learn from other communities, and that may be requiring to take some trips or maybe picking up the telephone. I'll give you an example. I was recently working on a target sector strategy for a client, and had no idea. It was an emerging. We were recommending an emerging technology, particularly around batteries. And one of the best things that I think we did was convince that client that it wasn't just about developing that strategy at the desk, but it was actually starting to pick up the phone and have some conversations with communities across the country that are actually having success in this. And I think, so not being afraid to pick up the phone, I think that, generally speaking, I think this is a field where, yes, communities are highly competitive, right? Look at the 238 applications for the Amazon RFP. But they are places that I think people are very pragmatic and want to learn from each other as well, right? So not being afraid to sort of pick up the phone and sort of share ideas is important. And then the third thing I would think is that, there are lots of really great organizations that have done a lot of really good work in terms of best practice inventories and selections. I think the ones that I look at often are, look at things that, for instance, that ICIC has done. The think tank in Boston has done a really nice job of putting stuff together. The Democracy Collaborative has done a really good job. CEOs for Cities, in terms of their clusters of practice, has been really successful. And then finally, the other thing is think about this, right? In the last 10 years, it's been interesting to sort of see the birth of data journalism around cities, right? With like City Lab and Next City and things like you're doing. And so there are a lot more resources out there, I think, around this idea of sharing of ideas than there ever have been.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. Well, I wonder kind of, when you're sharing these ideas, it requires a humility for a community to recognize that they may not have the answers. And I think of a lot of communities in our neck of the woods down here in Southwest Virginia that, they're still thinking, how do we get that next factory in? How do we get yada, yada, yada? And we've seen that workforce development is becoming an even bigger part of economic development than I think many of us thought it could be at this point. I wonder, kind of, when you look at those economic development trends, and where do you kind of see workforce development falling in that, and where do you kind of see where economic development seems to be headed moving forward?
Yep. So just a little bit of a pre-answer to that question about workforce. I think the question about, even the most successful communities realize that they have flaws and have to figure out issues, right? I mean, the quintessential community everyone points to as being a place that has done really well in the knowledge-based economy has been a place like Austin, right? I mean, even I've spent time the last couple of months down in Austin. I was doing some work with the Real Estate Council of Austin, and one of the things they realize is that even as successful as we've been, there are places that have done things better than we have on the development side. So even though successful cities realize they have to learn things from other folks. Direction of workforce, huge issue, right? I mean, site selection would tell you it's the defining issue for most companies. You read the RFP from Amazon that went out to all the cities. It was one of the key factors that was listed as one of the things that they were looking for. I think workforce development, again, lots of I think I think we'll see a greater role the private sector has to play here, right, in terms of shaping what those programs look like. I do think that we will see, and that what I mean by shaping that is that having to really maybe rebuild some of those relationships with our community college programs as well. as well as help shape some of these these on-ramp type programs. I think the other thing that what we have seen is a real sort of birth of these sort of third nonprofit, private sector, whatever it may be, sort of on-ramp programs, quick technology-based training programs or quick type of project management skill programs. And so I think that where a workforce system that was very sort of structured in terms of BA degree, associate's degree, blah, 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 I think we may be making a little bit of a dial change here to be a little bit more nimble, seeing the rebirth of some of these programs. And in fact, you could argue that even some institutions are starting, even places like my university, NYU, we're doing this, right? We're trying to be more nimble in our workforce training programs and trying to give really quick to market training programs that can solve some of the needs for workforce gaps that we have, and particularly here in the New York economy, but also thinking a little bit broader, right? So I think you'll see the more on-ramp programs, greater need of the private sector to play a role. But I think the challenge is how do you scale those programs? And I think that is still, if you talk to someone like who runs, organizations like Coalition for Queens or General Assembly or any of these types of programs that have been quite successful in terms of getting those quick skills. The challenge for a lot of those places would be scale. How do you reach more? How do we make the impact we're having greater? And a lot of that is going to depend on needing that infrastructure or to sort of support that.
Well, it is interesting because I do think that there's some stories that come out of West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky about turning coal miners into computer programmers, and that scalable question always comes to mind for me, but also the replicability in other communities. Like, if you can do that in this one community, that doesn't necessarily mean you can do that in every community. And I wonder how you get communities to kind of make sure that they're focusing in the right direction, especially when you have a smaller community like you mentioned Lynchburg earlier. How do you make sure that their work is contextualized to the work that needs to happen in that particular community?
It's about knowing what your assets are, right? I mean, that's one of the key things to this is, look, I think it is essential for communities to understand, what are your growth sectors? Who are you now? Where do you want to go in the future? And so that is a real, still a need in a lot of communities, right? Particularly a lot of smaller communities still don't have that real data-driven analysis about here's what our growth sectors are, here's what our workforce looks like, and here's how we build a strategy on that. And with that growth strategy becomes sort of that need for workforce development. So, and that's a real shame because there are really good data technology programs, platforms out there now, and obviously firms that are, that provide those services. So, I think for places like a Lynchburg, Virginia, or even like a Newark, New Jersey, or Leander, Texas, or whatever it may be, right? Depending on who you are, where you are, and what you are, understanding what your growth clusters are, understanding what your assets are, the role of, do you have anchor-based institutions? Essentially that really important economic development assessment 101 is really essential to being able to understand what your workforce needs are. Because you're right, not every place is created equal, right? Not every community across the country needs a software coding program, right? If you're a small town in Kentucky, you may be much more successful and much more effective developing a training program for assemblers or advanced manufacturing technology skills. We all don't, not everyone has to be part. Not every community has to be part of this quote unquote growing quote unquote creative or Richard Florida type of economy. It's about creating good jobs that are family wage, that supports the question of equity, and then by having those as essential goals and understanding what your assets are, then you can build good programs to get people into those jobs.
Do you find when you talk to some communities that self-knowledge is lacking, that they've got a narrative built up in their own head that doesn't meet the realities of what's there, that they're somehow living in the past sometimes? And how do you kind of get people to beyond looking at the data, come up with a new narrative, I guess, for what they are as a community?
Yeah, I mean that's a big issue wherever you go. I think particularly a lot of times if you're dealing with a little bit maybe smaller community that hasn't seen a lot of the growth, sort of significant booms in the economy that some places have seen. I think one of the key sort of first steps in anything that you do in terms of an economic development engagement is it's almost a re-education about what are your assets that a community has, sort of getting people to think about or to understand who they are as a community. And so in fact, we're doing a small project in Salmon Arm, British Columbia now. And it's actually not an economic development strategy, it's a place branding project. And one of the things that we're doing with them is helping them understand sort of their position within the British Columbia marketplace. And it has typically been a community that has been, older retirees, folks that were looking for, sort of the place to sort of hang their hat after they're done with work. And one of the things is that we spent a long time, particularly quite a bit of time for the first few weeks of our engagement, was really re-educating that community about the assets that they have a growing innovation economy, that actually they are seeing a growth in millennial talent. It is not the decline in millennial talent. And I think once you can start to re-educate folks, then you can actually get people excited about community-based initiatives. You can get folks engaged in the community. You can get folks thinking about how they can actually play a role and what a future looks like. So this re-education piece is important. In fact, one of the things that we did to sort of support that is we did a pretty extensive data survey with the community. And then compared that with the actual results, right? So we'd asked the community a question, we got the answer, and then what we showed was the data was sometimes opposite of what they thought, right? That it was actually not as dire as what maybe they thought it was, or it was a different viewpoint. And so that is a really important question. That's a really important thing sometimes is this question of re-educating the community.
Well, I think, there are a number of communities that have been able to kind of try and position themselves for the future, but that often seems to look the same in terms of, they want millennials, they want young people in there, and they want to support entrepreneurship and small business development, but these high growth companies, they want to find them. Do you think that that's something we're going to see only continue to grow, or is that going to fade away, or what do you kind of see as the future for those kind of trends?
Well, look, I don't think that sorry, overcoming a cold. We don't, I don't think that the startup economy is not going away, right? It is. We are still, the innovation economy is not going away. All those things are going to continue, and in fact, it's probably going to intensify. That said, right, we do know that, as we think about what one of the things that I would say to smaller communities is that one of the things that there's a great survey from Endeavor Global, which is an organization actually based here in New York, that looked at what entrepreneurs want in communities. They surveyed all the Inc. 5000 winners. Inc. 5000 being a list that Inc. magazine puts out of the fastest growing sort of startup firms. And what the things that came out of that was actually quite interesting is that it was really one of the driving factors now for entrepreneurs today. It was this question of quality of life and quality of place. It wasn't cost of business. It wasn't incentives. Yes, it was access to talent, but it was if you were a place that had great quality of place and provided access. So for smaller communities, places that aren't the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, the Seattles, the things that this real coming back to this real question about how do you invest in your downtown urban core, how do you make your community a better place to live? I think all has potential benefits to creating, not only making your place a community a better place to live for your residents, but it also makes your place a much more attractive place for investment. I was just yesterday in Jersey City, which is across the river here from New York. Jersey City has seen a significant boom in real estate development. It has seen it is now by many folks considered to be the sixth borough of New York. But I was with the deputy mayor. We were meeting with the deputy mayor about their technology-based startup cluster, and one of the things that he suggested is that one of the things that they did first was really invest in this question of quality of place, creating a community as a place to live, as a place that people could sort of see themselves, making their residents want to live there, participate in the community, be sticky, right, has paid off for them. And because of that, now they're seeing firms saying, hey, you've built up this interesting workforce. You've built up this interesting, great place to live. Hey, maybe this is a good place for me as an alternative, not to think about Brooklyn or Manhattan, that, you know what, Jersey City is a great place for me to build a business. And so they're now seeing a lot of technology-based firms make the investment in their community.
That's fascinating. I wonder, kind of, I'm sure you've been to a number of these different places and talked to a number of these different folks. I know you have as a consultant, but I wonder, kind of, when you go into a new place, or when you're going into a place maybe you've been before, but you want to see how it's doing now, what are some of those things that you look for that spring up as a indicator that something's going well or not?
Oh, man. I mean, it's so different from place to place, right? I mean, communities are different. I mean, one is the investment in the urban, or the sort of central urban core. It's always something interesting to look at, right? The amount of placemaking activities that are going on, right, in terms of the different things that are happening around town. I think also, always a good predictor if things are changing is not just necessarily sometimes the urban core, but what are the other neighborhoods out in the city, throughout the city doing? How are they thriving, and are they creating a sort of a unique identity? I mean, I think so. Thriving neighborhoods, thriving investment. I think the question of how, if you do have an anchor, how you're working with that anchor-based institution is something that we're always, looking at. But also how cities are really addressing some of the challenges, right? I mean, a city I love Austin, Texas, a city that I went to undergraduate at the University of Texas. I'm a huge Longhorn fan. I spent a lot of time there. But one of the things that it's a city that I always look to and say, well, I'm not sure if I can live here, because they've struggled so much with not dealing with some of the challenges that they have faced, right, with equity issues and sort of infrastructure issues. It's still an amazing city, and it's still a great place, but it feels like it's the teenage city that has kind of outgrown its infrastructure, outgrown its clothes, right, its infrastructure a bit. And because of that, right, I mean, you have to say, well, is that growth, quote unquote, sustainable, right? So looking at some of how cities are dealing with some of this some of these their equity issues and their growth issues, I think that's always a good, particularly for some of these growing cities. That's always a very interesting one to look at, and that's different from city to city, right? A place like Seattle is a place that's still, man, they're dealing with equity and transportation. Portland's dealing with this question of inclusion in the urban core. Austin's an infrastructure issue. Denver is one of those cities that has some of those investments and have benefited from that. It's I guess as you run through the list of quote unquote American cities, right? We've talked a lot about American cities. We could talk about others. There are things to look for that in terms of going really well, but also how are they dealing with some of the problems that they face.
That's fascinating, because I do think that there's as we mentioned, we talked about real estate development and economic development, and these are kind of things that you could do them without baking that equity or inclusion piece into it, but we're seeing that that's more and more important. And are you seeing that there's kind of a move to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're baking that piece a priority in that move?
Yes, think about this, right? A decade ago, we never talked about the word equity, right? Did we not? I mean, we sometimes talked about, quote unquote, and I'm using bigger, family wage jobs, right? But we never talked about equity, right? We never talked about inclusion. We talked about inclusion from the sort of Richard Florida sense in terms of wanting to be a place that's open to different types of people and backgrounds and things like that. But inclusion meaning that people can actually participate in the economy. I think that inclusion is absolutely for a lot of cities at the forefront of the agenda. I think it is not a nice to have. It's probably for a lot of cities and now very much a need to have. I mean, if you look at the American workforce, right? 33% of us do knowledge-based jobs. Maybe less than sort of another 18 to 20% of us do sort of traditional blue collar production-based jobs. And then again, these are percentages that change, right, depending on where you go. But we're just talking across the country. But most of the American workforce, right, most of the workforce, work in service-based jobs. Personal services, food care, child care, health care. which are all not great jobs, right? And we can, and so they're not having the economic means to actually actively participate. And one could argue that if you look at the rise of Donald Trump, right? I mean, a lot of that comes back to this idea of that we, as as economic developers, as folks who thought about building economies, haven't really considered this question of inclusion. And so you've got this divides of have and have-nots, and it is not sort of a thing that you want to fix it because you have to. I think you got to fix it because, there's some sort of moral and social obligations to it, but also because this can, this friction in our communities can create a sort of a threat to competitiveness as well, right? In terms of being a stable and business environment, being a place where people can see themselves living and working and making investments, and so it can become a threat to your economy as well.
Well, it's I think we're certainly seeing that move towards including this stuff. Is there any research that you've seen or examples that you've seen that have been particularly compelling in terms of communities that have done a good job kind of making that a crucial part of this development?
Well, I mean, I think that some places are now starting. This is such at the nascent stage, right? I mean, for a long time, like universities have thought about inclusion, right? For good or for bad, and have done the quintessential example of a place that thought about inclusive development and tried to build inclusive development right as an anchor-based institution. It's one that we all point to is Philadelphia in West Philadelphia. The University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia. You look at cities. I think an interesting city that's doing some really interesting work with this right now is Portland. Prosper. I don't know if you know this, but they changed the name of the Portland Development Commission to Prosper Portland. The name of the organization is now Prosper Portland. And if you look at the initiatives for the city, they have a regional economic development group that sort of sits above it in terms of Greater Portland Inc. But what's interesting about Prosper Portland, which is now the city agency, it is all based off of inclusion, and it's all based on equity practices, and it's all based on how they can sort of think about building more inclusive neighborhoods. And so I think that will be obviously that will be an interesting place to look at and to watch over time, and of how that what effect that they have. But again, very nascent, right, in terms of its stuff. I think you look at Kathleen Wynne, who's the Premier of Ontario, now has an inclusive prosperity agenda for Ontario, and some of the things that they're doing in terms of transportation, wages, requiring certain minimums. I mean, I think that is an interesting one. Again, very, very early in the stages, and if it will, how much traction it will get there. But generally speaking, I think that we are now starting to think about, for the first time, about this equity piece being on our agendas and being part of our action plans or part of our economic development strategy. Great example. We did the work for in Vancouver, Washington. Traditionally a very pro-business environment, a little bit more conservative. But one of the things that I found to be really sort of fulfilling about that process was getting their board of directors to understand the importance of equity and the importance of needing to think about inclusion as one of those measurement factors, one of those things that we track over the next course of the life of their economic development strategy. And it's something that that's something they all agreed on and will do, and they're now going to focus on even thinking about how they can recreate some of these pathway jobs and this workforce training piece. You mentioned workforce training earlier. This plays a big piece in this, right? If folks, the only way we don't solve, in my mind, and I'm sure folks will disagree with this, but we don't solve the equity challenge and the gentrification in our cities through building affordable housing, or only thinking about how we control the prices of transportation, the costs in our city. As an economic developer, I think that the way we can really have a real dent on those. And that's not to say that affordable housing and other things are important, but we really can change the trajectory of this by giving people the skills and the opportunity to participate in good family wage supporting jobs, or giving them the skills to actively participate in either the growing knowledge-based economy or a technology-based economy or advanced manufacturing, because we know that those create opportunities for people going forward.
It's all. I'm excited to see where this goes. I must say personally. So, well, I kind of, as we start to get this to a close, I wonder, Stephen, if you can tell us about something that you learned that you now think is really important, that kind of maybe you didn't expect to be thinking was so important at this point.
Well, you mean in terms of something that I'll give you an example. I was something I thought that was really interesting, and I guess it's an example. And I'll share this example partly because I was just recently at CEOs for Cities in Phoenix and had in one of the CEOs for Cities, a great conference. It brings together practitioners from all over the country to think about development and economic development. It's an interesting one because it brings both public and private sector folks together, and Lee Fisher's always done a wonderful job for their organization. But one of the things that as a university person that I have been thinking about in this idea, this role of anchor, something that I thought that was interesting that I didn't know before, was looking at the amazing transformation of downtown Phoenix. And the transformation of downtown Phoenix, particularly being led by the university there, ASU. And I found it to be interesting partly because a lot of times we think about anchor institutions in terms of thinking about how it helps to grow our economy and our traded sectors. But the interesting thing about ASU and what they did with the development there is that they actually locate, and as someone at a university, I found this to be interesting because we're doing some campus development in Brooklyn here in NYU, is that they relocated entire campuses downtown, right? So entire colleges and units downtown. And so the thing I think that I took out of this is that if for anchor-based institutions that really want to play a role, right, to really have a transformative impact, is that you kind of got to go all in, right? You can't just sort of I almost said half-ass it, but nonetheless, you can, right? You can't just sort of go. You've really got to go all in on a strategy, and I think this example of ASU was one that I took away and saying, hey, that's actually a pretty interesting way to think about that.
Well, very good. I wonder if you could close us out with the story of maybe something that you've seen or something that you've heard about that encapsulates what happens when a community does stuff well, like whether that's real estate development or economic development or any of these kind of things. Yeah.
I think a great example of community doing amazing things well is here in New York. There's a group of, and we were talking about on-ramps and training programs, and I think one of the things that gives me, excitement is a lot of times we talk about the quote unquote a creative or knowledge-based economy is that it can be quite exclusive, right? You got to have a university degree, you got to be, you've got to have a technology skill. But one of the things that I think is exciting about the future of this sort of the idea of the knowledge-based economy, the transformation of the economy, is that, if we can get people the skill sets to participate in short, quick fashion to market, as we were talking about earlier, they can actually we can really sort of transform people's lives. And I think a great organization that has done that and proved that here, and something that it's a good, sort of a good feel-good story to me is a group called Coalition for Queens. It's an organization that is focused on providing Queens residents access to technology-based jobs that are growing in the borough of Queens. And one of the things that they do is they select a group of 20 to 25 folks to go through their Access Boot Camp for 6 weeks, and they develop the technology skills in an app. And the data for that program and the impact of that program is amazing. I mean, you have people going from making $20,000 to $25,000 US to making over six figures within the transformation of 6 months. And so that is that whole question of, to our point earlier about workforce development, that pipeline, what's needed. And if we can do more programs like this Coalition for Queens, right? You think you can really have an impact on these question of equity and inclusion and trying to build a more sort of vibrant community for everyone.
Well, what a fantastic story and a hopeful one to end on. And I wonder, Stephen, if you can, if people are interested in hearing more about what you have to say or more about your work, where can they find out more about you?
Sure. You can find out more about us at sps.nyu.edu/urban lab. You can also check us out at creativeclass.com.
Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today, Stephen. If anybody listening is interested in CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But again, Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks so much. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia, and keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.